I'm Larry Leibowitz. I'm an old country lawyer from Knoxville. But I have the honor to be the chair of the Tennessee Holocaust Education Commission. The commission was founded by the legislature in 1984 when a governor named Lamar Alexander thought it was a good idea. And the original commissioners, all of us are appointed by the governor. I'm appointed as chair, and there are 12 public commissioners and then representatives of the Board of Regents and the University of Tennessee system and the Department of Education and the State House and Senate. The original commissioners included survivors that were Tennessee residents, liberators, American GIs that walked into concentration camps because they were told to, and it sort of changed their life when they saw the mass murder that had taken place wherever it was that they were. Ministers, the chaplain at Vanderbilt University was one of the original commissioners. So we've had a very diverse group of people running this commission for a very long time. Each year, we reach thousands of students and teachers and the general public with speakers and educational materials. The speakers include survivors, liberators, refugees, second generation folks whose parents or grandparents were survivors or liberators, and witnesses to the mass murder, like Father Patrick Dubois, a French priest that we have brought in from time to time to speak. Our funds come from private donations and generous state appropriations. So I'd like to thank the governor and the legislative leadership for continuing our appropriation each year and letting us do what we do. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to turn the podium over to the history department.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda.
It's great to see so many students, some of which I've seen in person for the first time tonight because they're my Zoom students. Just a few announcements. According to rumor, the further you get into that corner, the less likely you are able to hear. So you may want to, you're fine? Okay, great, awesome. I was gonna say, you may want to move around if you can't hear. If you're here for extra credit, there was a sign-in sheet back there, so make sure you sign in, because even if I saw you, I'm gonna forget I saw you. So make sure you sign in, okay? Okay, so that stuff done. I do wanna introduce our speaker then. Michael Berkowicz was born in 1944 in Siberia. His parents fled to escape the Nazis in Poland. After the war, they went back to Poland to find and reconnect with family and friends, and they found that almost nobody was there. And so I'm gonna let Michael tell his story and get out of his way. Thank you, guys.
Since I have no control over the mic, I assume you could hear me. Good. First and foremost, let me thank you for allowing me to share my story and to address issues that are becoming more and more critical, serious. So, thank you. Yes, as you heard, I was born in Siberia in January of 1944. So it was towards the end of the war, but not quite. I was born there because my parents, who originally came from Poland, decided, or my father decided, to escape the Germans. That's after being caught a few times for days' labor and mistreated. The interesting thing was that when they crossed the border, which was a river at that point, they were caught by the Russians, who essentially gave them an ultimatum. They said, we could send you back, no punitive action against you, but if you want to stay in Russia, you need to go to work in the coal mines of Siberia. Now, I want to make sure that the coal mines of Siberia were not a punitive engagement. It was simply like going to Alaska and getting a job. So they said yes, even though my father, who I towered over, was a tailor, an excellent European master tailor who actually taught, tailoring. Well, they started with the coal mine, but the word soon got out that my father knew European styles. Now that was a major thing because, in Siberia they were so, even the Russian commissars and members of the party were isolated from the European, from the West. But they knew that the West possessed some special qualities. And since the presence there preceded the annual May 1st parade. It was the Workers' Day, and it was the only official parade. So everybody wanted to look top-notch. Well, when they discovered that my father could accomplish it, they told them, forget about working in the coal mine, dress us well. So far, so good. They, at that point, paid only with food stamps. You could not buy food for money. It was allocated, and my parents accumulated a whole bunch of them so that they could then trade them for things that they needed. Before knew it, they were doing quite well. They were totally isolated from the stories of the Holocaust. Siberia news didn't travel so fast and so far. The notion that the family would not be there for them to return was as far from their mind as possible. My mother came from a family where she was one of 13 brothers and sisters. My father was one of 7, plus, of course, other relatives. So they thought that they should go back and to the places where the family was from and reconnect. After months of traveling in cattle cars back to Poland, they discovered that the Red Cross announcement that nobody survived was actually true. The issue was then, what do you do? Do you start a new life? And how do you do it? And how to relate to the Poles, the Polish society that was in many ways collaborating, participating with the Germans. Well, Jews who survived like that found places where they could organize a social, how should I put it, social environment where they could have schools, or they could have, theater, and so Poland suddenly became a country with Jewish presence limited to various areas. Why limited? Because going back to the places where we lived before, they lived before, meant essentially saying, this place, this building, this apartment is ours. It was taken away from us. We would like it back. Well, that did not meet with an attitude of course, here, thank you. Although there is one country, and that is Denmark, that had roses, flowers put in the apartments that belonged to Jews. So when they came back, they felt welcome. That was not the case in Poland. Life was peculiar because at this point I was 3 when we first came to Poland. Soon I was in school. Soon I was learning our history, Jewish history, the history of the war, and at the same time becoming a Polish citizen. We had a school, there were a number of them throughout the country, that was essentially a Polish school, high school, with the additional language, Yiddish, and the history of Jews being added to it. Well, that became a de facto Jewish high school, Jewish school. And everybody knew that the 7th Lyceum, which is how it was referred to officially, was attended by Jews. Poles did not want to be connected with that. And so that's where I went. Why do I tell you all of this thing? That to show you that even though we were absorbing our presence as that of a Polish citizen, we were not seen as such. We were officially, unofficially labeled, delegated to a group of strangers in this country. In some minds as the parasites, some minds as unwelcome presence in Poland. Why do I mention it? I mention it because the notion of suffering, the notion of persecution is not limited to violent, strong reactions, although that certainly existed in post-war Poland. Shouldn't be surprised that when Jews came back to the smaller towns and wanted the houses back, the businesses back, they were not met with open arms. They were treated as the enemy. So anti-Semitism came back. The lesson of the Holocaust went over the heads of most Poles. Most, not all. And we needed to feel that we were a rightful presence, but we were reminded daily, I was reminded daily, we don't belong there. They don't want us there. They want our properties and things, and let us go somewhere else. That was not easy to live with. To wake up every morning and be reminded by comments, catcalls, that we're Jewish and we're not here to be part of the Polish nation was very difficult. Isolation is never easy. So why am I here? Why not Holocaust survivors who were beaten, suffered? Well, first of all, Holocaust survivors in the traditional sense are dying out. There are very few, and every year fewer and fewer. So the concern that we will run out of witnesses and those that could share became of concern. It occurred to me through the years where every day, there wasn't a day, in fact, that I was not called a dirty Jew or a parasite or some other thing like this. And the interesting thing is that I felt as Polish as you could be. That was my language, that was my history, and yet I was not accepted. I was defined, as Jews had been for centuries and centuries, defined as Jews by others. It wasn't often that we said, excuse me, I am Jewish in case you want to know. No. We lived a life of isolation which put us closer together. So the ghetto-like arrangements of the surviving Jews was pretty straightforward. The neighborhood was Jewish. There was a school that was Jewish. There was some officially endorsed institutions, summer camps, Jewish community centers, but they were all very limited. Poles did not participate in that. So we, throughout all these years, felt diminished in the eyes of the outsiders. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to walk out of the house or the school and always have to look at over my shoulder. It wasn't because it took away any joy of social interaction. Did I have Polish friends? Yes, some. But even those relationships were at some point questionable. I remember a friend, at this point we were at the university, who was a neighbor, knew everything about us. And at one point we were discussing some issues, and he says, but you Jews, you have all the money. Imagine that. This is post-war, where Jews were stripped of everything, every possession they had. And here was a friend, somebody who grew up with me, somebody who ate at our house, who knew what was happening. And yet, when the time came to make a comment, he said, you Jews. He didn't have to even finish the rest. The mere fact of saying you Jews put me in a place that I didn't particularly want to be, but I had no choice. So the suffering took a different form, but it was certainly felt and it was certainly serious. I went through the high school, then started the university, and even there, assuming that the university was a place of well-informed, educated, liberal, if you will, people would embrace us. So here's the story. First semester, there is a major lecture class, probably double, triple the size of this. And no professor could remember the names of people there. There were too many of us. So we had a seating plan, and we had to sit in specifically assigned seats so the professor could look and say, okay, let's see, Mr. So-and-so. Well, the interesting thing was that that professor didn't appear to need my name looked up. He would say typically, all right, so we have a problem here. Let's see who would come up to the board and show us how, the solution. How about Mr. Berkowicz? After a while of repeated comments like this and being chosen, and my colleagues, other students said, does he know you? Because he's without the chart, he doesn't know anybody. And yet he knows your name. So I, during one of the breaks, went up to him and I said, Professor so-and-so, I would like to ask you a question because I've been asked if there is a relationship between us because people see that you remember my name, but nobody else's. And I would like to know why. He looked at me and said, Mr. Berkowicz, it's not because you're Jewish. What? Well, needless to say, it was clear that it was exactly that. And then he proceeded with a story. He had a friend, same name, whatever, insignificant, but a cover for what really registered in his mind when he looked at me. There is a Jew. I was accused at that same university of sabotage. Again, it was by chance that I was able to prove that I wasn't there where they officially put me. But I was never embraced. I never felt welcome. I never felt at home. Well, you may say, okay, what's the big deal? The big deal is then when you lose most of your family, when you lose most of your friends and other relatives, belonging becomes of paramount importance. And I had no place to belong. So the notion of being alone, not being accepted, being rejected, played a major, major role in my life. When Stalin died in 1953 and Poland became more open, more liberal, and allowed Jews to leave, we started thinking, where can we go? Clearly, the West was the only place. And we applied at first because, and that's another misconception, and by the way, I am sharing with you, and the intent here is to share, not to lecture. But inevitably, some fact gets into it, and it becomes more of a lecture-like tidbit. The notion that we might have family outside was an acknowledged fact by the Polish government and officials. So Jews were allowed, once you declared yourself Jewish, allowed visas and passports actually, to leave Poland, to reunite with your family. Well, here we were. We had no family to reunite with. They were all killed, murdered. What Jews of those days did, they would get together, groups of people from the same village, town, and they would create records, witness accounts of what happened to their families. They were called Landsmannschaft societies. Why do I bring this up? Because one day, and at that point we were already living in the Bronx, I came home and I see my father at the dining table in front of a book, tears running down his face and sobbing. And I immediately go over and I said, "Dad, what's happening?" And he pointed to the book, which was an account of a member of the group that essentially described how his father was killed by a sadistic assessment down in the street. I will not describe the details, but let me assure you, they really turned even me one step removed. I never met him. My grandfather, that is. And so I was reading what was described there. It was all in Yiddish. And my father looked up at me, and with tears running down his cheeks, he said, the voice slightly higher pitched, "This was my daddy." And looked up at my daddy, not my father, not my relative, like a child. He looked at me like a child, and he acted. There were a lot of incidents like this, reminders. In fact, my mother's family owned some lumber yards in a town called Kelzer. Those of you who may be familiar with that post-war history, Kelzer was the site of a post-war pogrom not set up by the Germans. The Germans were no longer there. It was strictly organized by Poles. The story was that a kid who ran away from home for a week, when he came back and he needed to have an excuse for his parents, he said, "I was kidnapped by the Jews. I was brought to a building that they had, the community building, and I saw Polish Christian children being killed so they could use the blood for making the matzah." A preposterous accusation, but it was there. Within a short period of time, Polish locals, Polish militia, and Russian soldiers and others gathered at the building that was the community building. And there were about 50 or so Jews living there temporarily while looking for the family and things like this. And he said that's where it was. Well, you can't let a crime like this go unpunished. So suddenly, the beginnings of a pogrom. Why did I think it was important to bring it up? Well, first of all, let me tell you that that building didn't have the lower level that the kid claimed was where Jews were holding the Polish Christian children. So there was no, truth to it. Already there was a contradiction. But that wasn't what struck me. Years later, when I was involved in building a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw, Poland, I would do a lot of public speaking and support, donations, all of that. And inevitably, there would be somebody in the audience who would raise his hand and said, but what about the pogroms? What about, the killings? And I said, well, pogroms did happen, but how large were they? Oh, the one in Kielce, happened to pick the one that I knew about, hundreds. Really, and where did you get the information? He said, my mother. Okay, and I said, would you be surprised if I told you that that pogrom, as real as it was, had 50 victims, 49, 50. One of them was a Polish woman who just looked Jewish, so she was killed. This pogrom was in the newspapers of Poland all over. You would think that that would put Jews in a protected category, just the opposite. And Jews were attacked on trains when they were going to the places of their families' origins, and thrown off, killed. So much so that Jews refused to travel by train, and that was the only way to travel. Tragic. But what was interesting to me was that here the word spread by Jews was that hundreds were victims, whereas in reality, 49. Now, mind you, I am not suggesting that 49 is a number that is acceptable. Far from it. But that was the reality. And if you're going to deal with history, you have to deal with reality. You can't create your own version. Came to America, land of the free, streets supposedly paved with gold, and all of the wonderful things. And, well, the first unfortunate thing was that the streets were not paved with gold. And the idea that we were now in a free country that accepts Jews completely, embraces their presence, became questionable to me. Because things that many of you to this day take for granted and don't give it much thought, to me there were signs of still existing anti-Semitism. For example, I was learning English. I didn't speak it, so I was very much into words and things. The phrase, "he Jewed me down," that's clearly an anti-Semitic common statement. And yet it was very common. And and I lived in New York, so it was where there were a lot of Jews there, so I didn't have to feel as threatened by all of this. But I was aware. So here, the suffering of non-acceptance, rejection, that stayed with me through all my growing up years was renewed when we came here. shared my story and some of the things with friends at the university, it was not enough. It was not enough to assure me of peace and acceptance and belonging. That in itself is a very, very difficult life to lead. So, yet there was no blood, there was no murders, there was just a sense of rejection, painful rejection, because there didn't appear to be any possibility of change. You know what? As years went by, we now live with a certainty that we are not safe. But again, the notion of suffering, the notion of being not accepted, created a number of serious issues, whether it was at university, as you heard, whether it was in local interactions. I was not feeling at ease. I didn't hide being Jewish. There was no reason for that, particularly because I lived in New York City. But I was not comfortable. So the notion that there are elements that we do not take as given anti-Semitism, that we have to experience it, and that we continue to be victims of the Holocaust. I tried to be as American as I could be. English became my language. American history, Western history became my history. There was nothing about me, because I was not an observant Jew. That's another thing that you should remember. I was an American, citizenship and all. But the fact that we didn't feel American, that we were not made to feel American, that we had to grab it and take it and say, yes, I might be Jewish, but I am an American. All of that was not easy. You know, one of the things that my wife Bonnie and I did professionally was designing synagogue interiors, including Holocaust memorials. Most of them were for local communities, but we had one that we did in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Outdoor space, very prestigious location, across from the Capitol building. And we were thinking, what can we do as a memorial to those that perished, that suffered, particularly because it's in Puerto Rico. The exposure to the Holocaust to the Puerto Ricans was practically non-existent. So we, out of this debate of what and how, came up with a solution that the absence of Jews in the towns, in shtetls, which are small towns, was significant, but not addressed. So we designed the memorial, which sort of captures how we feel about being Jewish. Here is a steel structure looks like a torn page. The center of it has a light, as if the flames of the crematorium is there, and then cut out slightly larger than life-size figures of a family, parents and children. And they're just cut out, and you could walk through it. And the notion was, those people who were never born could have been doctors, lawyers, artists, scientists, writers, you name it, and they will never be. Never be is a tough thing to accept, especially when you value those traditions. And it sort of connects with the idea that I may not officially, strictly speaking, be a Holocaust survivor, although I was born during the war, but so far away from it that I felt like a survivor. I grew up with survivors. I grew up with a community that essentially was Jews who survived in various ways the Holocaust period. This represents the same kind of notion. I have to admit that it is a difficult thing for me to have assumed the role of a Holocaust survivor. A little bit of guilt. I didn't suffer. I didn't starve. And yet, I felt like a victim. I lived with it every day. There was some other story. Come home and say, you know, we just met so-and-so. He was the butcher in our town. And, you know, it's a constant feed of reminders with stories connected to it. So I think that I was a victim of that view and slowly got involved in standing up, being Jewish, not allowing, you know, the stigma to be evident. I was proud and am of being in America. I am. With all of its problems, and the problems do exist. And my role, how I defined my success in this engagement, is to show that we're still here, we're not about to leave, but we need to engage as many non-Jews in acknowledging us as valuable assets of this country. And that shouldn't be that difficult if you're willing, if you're open-minded to see how many scientists, how many doctors, how many lawyers are Jewish. In fact, all I hear is, if you need a good lawyer, hire a Jewish lawyer. Yeah. Needless to say, he's a lawyer, Jewish lawyer. I want that notion that there are thousands of us referred to as the second generation. We are the generation that came immediately after the victims of, and be accepted, be acknowledged for the value that we present. I have to tell you that I'm very hard of hearing. So while I'm about to open it to, question and answers, it is my wife who may repeat to the question so I answer the right question. It's open to you.
So, questions?
Hello. Is this working?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Derek, and it's nice to meet you. Israel became a nation in 1948. Was there ever any talk in your house about, maybe going to Israel, or, what's going on there in Israel, that kind of thing?
Actually, an excellent question, because after this pogrom, half of the Jews left, ostensibly for Israel, because that made sense, but they'd get to Vienna, which was and then they decide, no, let's go to the US or Australia or South America. So we did too, Israel, of course. So in those days, those years, Israel was a tough country to make a living. In Poland, in the West, being a doctor would put you in a certain level of income and things. In Israel, every other person was a lawyer or a doctor. So making a living was not that simple. In fact, not advertised, not shared. Many Jews who left Poland returned after a couple of years when they found living in Israel just too difficult. So yes, we applied for a reason that to this day is a mystery. We were denied the passport. Don't know why, but you didn't question that. So we looked for another place to go, and we discovered somebody with the same last name in Brazil. So they agreed to do the required things, affidavit of support, make sure that we are not going to be a burden on the local society, and bought tickets. Last minute, we discovered that there was another Berkowicz in New York. Didn't matter whether he was related or not, but turns out that it was a Berkowicz distantly related from the same town in Poland, which was enough to convince the Polish government that we should be allowed to leave. So instead of going to Brazil, my parents just junked the tickets and applied to come to the States. It's interesting because people say, so you came with your parents, and to some degree, my parents came with me, because the US of A had a very strict quota system. Couldn't just bring immigrants, Jewish or not, but particularly Jewish. So we had to go through all of the technical things that were involved, letters from the bank, assurances. In fact, my father was supposedly going to, and a job was waiting for him. If a job is waiting for you, you're unlikely to be a burden. Of course, this was all fake. My father, as I told you, was an excellent tailor. ended up, of course, in his profession, but not as a master tailor, but as a piecemeal worker. And he would come home and say, you know what, this Hispanic girl next to me, she does this, puts her sleeves in twice as fast as I could possibly do. But it's okay. They don't look for imperfections. He did. So he didn't make much. But he, again, was discovered to be a skilled tailor, and very quickly, not quickly enough for him, he became a sample maker for the fashion designers. What they would do is they would come to him with a sketch, and he would convert it into patterns and make them. The odd thing about it was that my father very quickly realized that he could do it in any size he wants. They didn't say make it in an extra small or something. So he did all of his samples in my mother's size. My mother was the best dressed, high fashion woman who herself didn't realize how well dressed she was. Because after all, her husband brought it home. But she was. And he loved being appreciated by those that needed his skill. And he didn't want to retire. And my mother kept saying, enough, you worked hard enough. And he would hide the fact that he was still working. She says, where are you going? Oh, I'm going to see some friends downtown. Where in reality, he was going back to the shop and continued working. Yes, that was nice. But the fact was that he never acclimated to the American way of life. He still had the old European notions of what is right, what is wrong. And eventually he retired, passed away, but passed away with a smile. And that was very important to me. To this day it is. So I hope I answered it. Thank you.
Answer. Questions?
Hello, my name's Patty. I teach in Knoxville. And I was wondering, what year did you actually come to America, and did you study something when you got here?
What was that?
What year did you come here, and what did you study when you came here?
Oh, well, that's easy. 1962, I was 19, and I studied at first electrical engineering. After a couple of years, I didn't like, actually, I might as well share it since this is all about sharing. I was a pretty decent student. And here is an exam that consists of one problem, lengthy problem, and I thought I did very well, and I get a failing grade, because it was either you passed it or you failed. So I go to the professor, and I say, I'm sorry, but I think that you misjudged your thing, and he looks at it and says, you know, you're right. I never thought of it like this, but you're right. But I'm not changing a grade. Why is that? It's a failure. This is not some 96 to 90. You know, he says, I'm too busy for this. I was beyond upset. I went straight to the physics department, said, here's my grade point average, here are my courses, I want to switch to physics. Pure science, very different attitude. And everything seemed to be okay, except one day I was taking a mathematical physics course, and the professor said, no, here we have a problem, and the problem is, it explained how, and the problem solution that he was proposing was, how should I put it? There were two solutions to it. For those of you studying science, quadratic equation. And he essentially said one of them implies that whatever happens in the future depends on what happened before. A typical, logical, scientific approach. The other solution said whatever happens in the future depends on what will happen further in the future. Well, the first one applied the rules of causality. Something happens, but the second essentially said predestination. And the professor looked at them and says, obviously this is a trivial solution, and in cases like this, we throw out the trivial solution. And I sat there amazed. Just like that, we arbitrarily decide the nature of our future, but that's what it was. So I started moving away from science, although to this day I believe that both science and religion are in search of the same thing. Where we come from, who are we, all of those things. I became less of a scientist, although I taught physics for 7 years. I chose to become an artist, a designer. And Bonnie studied industrial design, but we created a team where we designed Holocaust memorials and synagogue interiors, sanctuaries, chapels. We did some work for churches, but it wasn't significant. Anyway, so here I am, retired, sort of, or prompted to retire, but still very involved with the issues of being Jewish. You can't walk away from it if you're Jewish. You're dragging behind, and that's why I must tell you that being invited to speak and to share with you is extremely important. It's important because I hope that my story broadened your view of anti-Semitism and suffering, and that it's not always the need for broken bones and blood to define suffering, that you could suffer like I did and continue to some degree by virtue of these other feelings and reactions to us. Any other questions?
Yes, I was just wondering how you have been able to find closure regarding everything that has happened to you, if possible.
Wow, fascinating question. Who says I found closure? I'm still searching for it. And maybe one day I will. But the world would have to change for me to find that closure. But thank you for asking that.
I was just gonna ask, how did you meet your wife, and then
How did I
also-
meet my wife? Wow.
and then also how has your experience affected your relationship as well?
Wow. The romantic story you want? I, as a furniture designer, had a major furniture showroom to the trade. It was a building where only interior designers and architects were allowed to shop. And one day, this beautiful young woman, yes, it was her, walked in with a sort of a briefcase, a case, and said, look, we have a common photographer, and he suggested that I speak to you. I designed some ritual objects, and one of them was this magnificent menorah, candelabra. And at first, candelabra, it had images of these, convoluted shapes, and then she opens up the case, and there is this magnificent modern Hanukkah menorah. Well, not only was I taken with her beauty, now I had a double whammy. And she said, look, most of your things are furniture with surfaces that are not being used. Why don't you put them on top of the cocktail tables or consoles? And people, because I'm sure you have a lot of Jewish clients, which was true. And we started looking at these things. And because I had a furniture factory where a lot of the material, acrylic, which was a very expensive material, but when you make a large piece of furniture, the offcuts, unless you make small things, have no value. So we started discussing what could be done. We have a lot of this, a lot of that. And we became partners. We were partners for 11 years before I declared my intentions. So we created, together actually, the American Guild of Judaic Art, because we wanted to organize to make Judaic art a field of appreciation, acknowledgement. And we then started a business. Well, guess what? We are still together. And by the way, Bonnie is Jewish too. Yeah. So yeah, that's how we met, and that's how we are here together, still in love.
By the way, it's a lot nicer being retired together than it is working together with your spouse.
Yeah.
The hatred of Jewish people is one that seems to defy borders and has persisted throughout time for basically thousands of years. And I just wanted to know why you think that is. What is it about the Jewish people that evokes so much hatred in so many different people?
Wow. You know something? If I know the answer to that, I wouldn't be here. Probably the White House, no? That's a puzzle. That's a puzzle, because when you examine history with a degree of impartiality, without prejudice, you will discover that Jews created many of the countries. In fact, Poland itself was a feudal, not very organized collection of land with landowners who got it by force. And at some point, the king of Poland decided that they need to organize an industry. But they didn't know how to do it. So they turned to two groups. West of Poland was Germany, but not as a unified country. It was city-states and all of that. And they invited the Germans and the Jews, who were known for, Jews created Poland's industry, marketing. But again, sometimes the good things become the things that are not always the best. For example, because Jews were creating laws of commerce, and one of them was, if you're going to sell something, you have to have proof of where you got that to sell. Jews are human beings. I shouldn't have to say that, but just to be sure. So stolen goods became the purview of Jewish merchants, resented by the Polish merchants who knew this was stolen goods. So here it is, a positive thing turns into a very negative thing. Otherwise, I don't have an answer.
Hi.
Oh, there's one more?
Hi. I'm an educator, and I'm certainly concerned, as other educators are, about law.
Wait, Bonnie needs to hear that because he's an educator and...
Sorry. And I'm certainly concerned, as I know other educators are, about laws being passed in the state and throughout the country saying what we can and cannot. I'm a social studies teacher. What we can and cannot teach when it comes to certainly the black experience and slavery. Are you, as a member of the Jewish community, concerned about those things also happening to your history in this country?
Are you concerned about the laws that are being passed controlling what can and can't be taught?
Say it again.
Are you concerned about the laws that are being passed that control what is being taught?
Well, of course I'm concerned. I'm concerned about the laws. I'm concerned about the growth of anti-Semitism. I thought we were beyond that. We're far from it. One of these days, maybe I'll have the answer. I'll look you up.
I'll give you my number.
Do you think that we've regressed in how we treat each other? I mean, the Jewish people, the black people, the Indian people, there's so much I'm almost 72, and it seems so sad to me. I thought we were beyond some of this, and I think we've regressed, and it's getting worse. I feel like that. Do you feel the same way?
Well, I have mixed feelings. Since everything is relative, the situation in the States is relatively much better. But once you get over this, it's better then. You come to the point of how bad is it? And good it isn't.
I'm always overly friendly. So you tell me, do you want to do one more?
One more. Why not?
Question?
Thank you for coming to speak tonight. I am also an educator. We seem to be hogging the mic tonight. I teach 7th and 8th grade English language arts, and I have, it's one question, but I'd like two different answers. For someone in that age group who's interested in the history, do you have a book recommendation? And then, do you have one for all of us here?
A book?
A book recommendation.
Ah,
You're on your own with that one.
let me see. There are dozens upon dozens of them. How do I choose the one? You know,
If you could recommend something for a student who's interested in the history, for maybe 13 to 15 years old, do they still read Anne Frank?
well, I'll tell
I know
you
that
what.
one's been in the news recently.
Anybody who's truly interested in pursuing that, meet with me, because I need to get more of a sense. You know, honestly, it's funny that you say 8th graders, because 2 weeks ago I gave a lecture, not unlike this, to 8th graders who loved it. How could I tell you they loved it? 70 of them sitting on the floor, and not one of them nodded off. But you're welcome to get in touch with me, and I'll be glad to help you with the program.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you all for coming. This is great. I'm so appreciative. We have a full house. That's really awesome. It's been a long time. It's been since the beginning of the pandemic that we've had a full house here. So I'm thrilled. Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Let me just say that if anyone wants to get a list of Holocaust-related resources, feel free to look on the website of the Tennessee Holocaust Commission or to talk to any of our staff, because that's what they do. There is a series of books on the American Jewish experience written by a man named Stephen Birmingham. It may be a little above 8th grade. The first one is the Grandees. Those were the Jews that left Spain because of the Spanish Inquisition and wound up, the first group of them were in Recife, Brazil. And the Inquisition caught up with them. They set sail north and got to New Amsterdam. And in New Amsterdam, Peter Stuyvesant didn't want to let them off the boat. But then somebody reminded him that many of the directors of the Dutch East Indies Company happened to be Jews who had left Spain because of the Inquisition, and it would be really good politics for him to let them in. So that was the first group of Jews in the 1600s. The second book is Our Crowd. That's the German Jews who came along with German Christians, big wave of immigration, in the 1860s. And of the Jewish cohort of those immigrants were people like the Goldmans, the Saxes, the Lehmans, and so on. They kind of put oomph into Wall Street. And then the third book relates to Michael and I. The name of that book is The Rest of Us, and that is the Jews of Eastern Europe who came from the shtetls of Poland and Romania and Ukraine, as we did. Thank you all for coming.